Everyone who missed today or wanted to get another taste, I'm going to go through the Choose Your Own Adventure lesson that we did today on Friday's class. So, yeah, as I explained in class, Matthew 19 through 22, it's got so much interesting stuff happening. There's no way we could cover it all, and so I put it to everyone to decide what kind of thing they wanted to learn about. Marriage and divorce, Jesus' teaching on marriage and divorce, Jesus' teaching on wealth, Jesus' teaching on church and state. Overwhelmingly, every block chose marriage and divorce. So I'll load up those notes and cover it once more. So, marriage and divorce. The text in question here is Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. I will read it real quick just to refresh our memories. When Jesus finished these words, he left Galilee and went to the district of Judea across the Jordan. Great crowds followed him, and he cured them there. Some Pharisees approached him and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatever?" He said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh?' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate." They said to him, "Then why did Moses command that the man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If that's the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." He answered, "Not all can accept this word, but only those to whom that is granted. Some are incapable of marriage because they were born so, some because they were made so by others, some because they have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Whoever can accept this ought to accept it." So, a lot going on here, but you'll notice a couple things here. So first off, if you didn't realize, in the Mosaic Law, divorce was allowed. The question was like, for what reasons could it be allowed? Was there any limit on this? But it was definitely allowed. And so that's why the Pharisees are testing Jesus on this. Like, what are the limits of divorce? Is there any case where you can't get divorced? And Jesus surprises the heck out of them by saying, "No divorce, ever." And yeah, he does this by quoting the Genesis creation stories, both Genesis chapter 1 and 2, kind of weaving them together. And he's saying, yeah, Moses allowed it, but I'm going to go to something before Moses was around. This is just baked into human nature itself. This is how the original plan for marriage should have gone. One man, one woman forever, or for their lifetime. And then he gives the reason for why divorce is wrong or impossible, saying that God has joined them together in marriage. Therefore, no human being can separate them or must separate them. God gets involved in the putting them together. Therefore, anyone who divorces their spouse and marries another is committing adultery because they're still married in the eyes of God, according to Jesus. He gives the exception here unless the marriage is unlawful. We'll talk about that later. But for now, the general rule is going to be remarriage after a divorce is adultery. And then his disciples, understandably, are like, "Well, then screw marriage. It's better just to go stag." And Jesus is like, "You're right. It is. But not everyone is called for that. Celibacy is totally legitimate. Celibacy, by the way, if you didn't know, it's not just not having sex. That's abstinence or continence. Celibacy is when you make a permanent vow or an ongoing vow to remain unmarried for the sake of God's kingdom. So celibacy, you don't have to be a like vowed religious person to do it, but it's most often in the case of people who take vows for religious life that they become celibate. So, looking at the catechism to follow this up, 3 catechism paragraphs in that I want to show you: 1638, 1639, 1640. 1638 is saying, from a valid marriage arises a bond which between the spouses, which by its very nature is perpetual and exclusive. Furthermore, in a Christian marriage, the spouses are strengthened and, as it were, consecrated for the duties and the dignity of their state by a special sacrament. So it's saying there are two types of marriage, natural and sacramental. Notice how it makes the distinction between just a normal valid marriage and then a Christian marriage, or a marriage in which the spouses are baptized. And yeah, according to the church, it doesn't have to be a Catholic marriage in order to be a sacramental marriage. As long as the two persons are baptized, they are, whether they recognize it or not, they are in a sacramental marriage. Both are good according to the church. Natural is good, sacramental's better because you get the graces of the sacrament. But then there are more duties and it's indissoluble, as we'll see. 1639. The consent by which the spouses mutually give and receive one another is sealed by God himself. From their covenant arises an institution confirmed by the divine law even in the eyes of society. The covenant between the spouses is integrated into God's covenant with man. Authentic married love is caught up into divine love. So it's saying sacramental marriage specifically is a covenant, God's covenant. It's not a contract. Contracts can be broken. Marriage, sacramental marriage, is a covenant that depends on God and his fidelity. So even though we might break the terms of our covenant, the covenant still stands, unlike a contract where if both parties broke the contract, it would be unenforceable. With a covenant, it remains because it's dependent on God. So 1640 takes us to the logical conclusion then. Thus, the marriage bond has been established by God himself in such a way that a marriage concluded and consummated between baptized persons can never be dissolved. This bond, which results from the free human act of the spouses and their consummation of the marriage, is a reality, henceforth irrevocable, and gives rise to a covenant guaranteed by God's fidelity. The church does not have the power to contravene this disposition of divine wisdom. Consummation, by the way, is a fancy way of saying sleeping together. So once the vows have been made, so the marriage is concluded, and they've slept together as man and wife, so they've consummated the bond, the church is saying it cannot be broken, it can't be dissolved, such that the partners would be free to marry someone else. Till death do you part, because God made it. So, a couple things to talk about. You don't need to write these down, but for those who are curious, the church does say that not every marriage is actually necessarily a marriage. There are some marriages that are, according to Jesus, unlawful, which could be dissolved or declared invalid, is the modern term. This is why the church is saying a valid marriage. There are invalid marriages. The way that this works is annulments. So instead of getting divorces, the church allows for people to get an annulment, or a declaration of nullity is the fancy term. Annulment is kind of like a slang term. But it's the difference between a divorce and annulment is a divorce is saying this marriage did exist at one point, but now it's over. The contract is ripped up, is no longer in play. But there was a marriage, and now that marriage is over. An annulment says what we thought was a marriage turns out, upon further investigation, wasn't a valid marriage at all. And therefore, they were never married, the people involved. Therefore, they are free to marry for the first time, as it were. So, divorce says there was a marriage, it's over. Annulment says there was no marriage to begin with. That doesn't take away from the experiences that people had, right? Like, clearly, you were together. Clearly, there was love at some point, right? Hopefully. But it's just saying that the sacrament of marriage never took. It didn't catch. And therefore, you're able to be free to marry someone else. What has to happen in order for an annulment to be granted? It all has to do with that moment the vows were given. If two people who are baptized, who knew what they were getting into with the vows, who meant the vows, and who said those vows, they can never be declared in an annulment, or like they could never have their marriage declared null. Um, but sometimes, oftentimes, as it were, people get into marriages not meaning what they say, or not understanding the vows that they were making, or being in an incapacitated state when they made the vows, or being unduly pressured from other people or the circumstances. Um, you have to show, and what happens, like, let's say you have a marriage, you want to get an annulment. You go down to the Diocesan Marriage Tribunal. It's the church court for marriage. They begin an investigation of your vows, of your marriage, and they're going to focus specifically on the moment of vows. And the key is figuring out if one or more of the parties in the marriage couldn't have meant what they said, or didn't understand what they were saying, and how can we prove it? The easiest type of annulment that's given these days is Catholics who marry outside of the church without the proper permission. They are automatically in an invalid marriage. All they have to do is file paperwork. The hardest type of annulment to grant is where you suspect that, like, the husband or the wife didn't mean one of the vows. They were just paying lip service to it in order to get married, and later, they're cheating on you, or they're abusive, or they aren't willing to have kids, or something like that. Trying to figure out how they might have manifested a lack of intent, and you can get witnesses involved. You might have evidence be brought into play. Um, it can get pretty drawn out and intense. When it's done well, when it's at its best, annulments, people who go through them to say it's incredibly healing because it's helping them come to terms with what they were involved in the past. Maybe where it went wrong, maybe how they got into that situation in the first place, what God wants for them in the future, what they're called to now that they're trying to. Usually, these annulments are granted by people seeking to enter into a new marriage. So, what their new marriage should look like and how it should be different. And yeah, they feel God's forgiveness and mercy and grace through the process. So that's when it's done well, when it's at its best, when everyone involved is, yeah, cooperating with God's grace. Other questions about marriage that came up in a lot of the blocks. Yeah, if your spouse turns into a monster after the fact, like, let's take my marriage for instance, because I don't think a marriage tribunal in the world exists that would ever grant my marriage a decree of nullity, because it was so manifestly clear to so many people that Alexis and I knew exactly what we were getting into and desired it, and um, yeah, that we were totally free to walk away if we wanted to, etc., etc. Um, so, yeah, good luck getting an annulment in my case, right? And let's say tomorrow I wake up and my wife has become a psychopath. She's been hit in the head, and now she's just a monster, and she's abusing me. Um, what can I do? Can I get an annulment? No. Can I get a divorce? Yes, if necessary. I can certainly separate and um, live my life totally apart from her and have no contact whatsoever if necessary. Absolutely. In fact, that can be the right thing to do if it's the way to stay safe. Um, but I am not free to get remarried. I am not free until she dies or I die. Neither of us can get married again legitimately in the church. So I made my vow. I know that God is giving me the grace to handle whatever life throws at me. And yeah, there's a certain peace that comes with that. Like, I'm not worried about what might happen because, yeah, this is not my marriage that I created on my own. This is a marriage that God wrote that I'm playing a part in. So, yeah, whichever direction it goes, I can trust that it'll work out. And even if it looks ugly to the world, if I cooperate with the grace that's given to me, I don't need to worry about being unhappy, even though my circumstances might become dire and crazy bad. I can be confident that what I need to be at peace and actually flourishing will be given to me. So, yeah, it can demand, like, sacramental marriage can demand heroism from people. You might have to rise to heroic levels of holiness and patience and love in order to flourish. But it's available to you, the grace that you need in order to flourish, and no matter the circumstances. So yeah, what about spouses who are being abused, can't get an annulment, and they have kids, and they can't provide for themselves? The church has a duty, I'd say, like if you know anyone like that, um, to bring that to the attention of your pastor, so that everyone in the church can get involved in helping that mother and child is how it most often works out, but um, that family to be supported and get the help that they need, even just like, yeah, starting a fund for them. Um, but yeah, sometimes the church sucks at making that available or communicating that to the people. Um, but yeah, if necessary, the church should pitch in to help people in dire straits like that, so they don't have to turn to like, oh, I need to get married real quick so that I can support my kids. That shouldn't have to be anyone's situation. All right. Feel free to email me any questions on this stuff. Um, the next part of this was just discussion. Here's what I'll leave you with. You don't need to write it down, but what do you think of Jesus' teaching? What if, let's say you hate this teaching or you deny that this teaching is legit or think that it's a bad idea. What would it take for you to be convinced otherwise? That's usually a deep question that I like to put to people after they've made up their mind about something. All right, now that you made up your mind, what would it take for your mind to change? And that will usually tell you a lot about yourself and um, yeah, what you might not have considered earlier. So have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday. Later.